Hey folks, it's Cody Stoffer with Playmakers Corner, here to tell you about Code Red coaching. Competing in athletics means you've lifted the weights, you've watched film, and you've got the passion. Problem is, that's what everyone else in the state has done. Perfect your game by honing in on your mental performance with Code Red coaching. Whether you are a team or an individual, Code Red coaching has the tools to create mentally solid habits and set up you or your team for success. Find Code Red Coaching at coderedcoaching.com or call 720-979-1914 to learn more today. That's coderedcoaching.com or 720-979-1914 today. Now back to the show. What is up, folks? I am your host for today, Cody Stoffer. Happy belated Thanksgiving. Very thankful for all of our listeners here and thankful to do another awards episode here. Here today, we got our 3A awards here where we are going to talk about the Coach of the Year, Newcomer of the Year, Defensive Playmaker of the Year, Offensive Playmaker of the Year, and the Most Valuable Playmaker. The way that these awards work is that we have a committee here that polls and gives their opinions. These opinions are provided this episode by Coach V, Gino V Hill, Gideon, Phoenix, myself, as well as you, the fans. The Twitter poll here, and the way that it works is whoever has the majority wins that poll, and the tiebreaker is decided by you, the fans. So whoever has more of a percentage on the Twitter poll is the person who wins any of those tiebreakers. Very excited to talk about all of these nominees today and to get into the action of yet another fantastic season of 3A football and recap it, as well as review our All-Playmaker teams that we comprise here at the Playmakers Corner podcast. So, with all of that being said, let's go ahead and jump into our very first category here. In the meantime, make sure that you are looking at our Twitter/X or our socials to know who the nominees are and where to vote for. But the very first category that I'm going to cover is Coach of the Year here. And we got to look no further than how these schools have performed this season. So our very first nominee is an old coach of mine, actually, and that is Nate Johnson of Pomona here. Now, this is under the guise of regular season performance here. And so talking about Pomona here, this team in the regular season here lost 3 games here, but all to very top teams here. 4A Pueblo West only lost by 4, lost to 4A number 1 seed Dakota Ridge, and lost to the number 1 seed in 3A Thompson Valley. So very tough schedule here, but they persevered and had themselves a very, very impressive regular season here, and put themselves in a pretty solid spot here, sitting at a nice 7-3 record. That is a massive upgrade from where they were last season in 5A here. And so, we wanted to recognize that bounce back, where I think they only won 1 game last season, I want to say. Something like that. It was a tough year, but this year they have turned it around, averaging 38.9 points per game and only allowing 17.5 points per game and posting a very impressive record at home as well. They've been able to get it done behind Coach Johnson's leadership. So shout out to my guy Nate there, and secured the number 3 seed in the postseason. Moving along to our next candidate here, it is somebody that we just talked about here, and that is the number 1 seeded Thompson Valley Eagles, led by Jamie Steele here. An undefeated regular season here, averaging 23 points per game, but only allowing 5 points per game in the regular season. I mean, they only allowed 7 to a very strong Berthoud squad out of 2A, and then had a shutout, allowed 9 points against Timnath, and then 3 consecutive shutouts followed, 2 of which were against playoff teams such as Loveland, which is a crosstown rivalry that they've been able to get their get back for the past couple of years, and then against another playoff team in Severance for 3A. Then they allowed 7 against Mountain View before following that up with another shutout over Fort Morgan here. And I mean, they've just been able to roll all season long, including finishing the season with a touchdown win over Roosevelt and a 9-point win over Pomona. So Jamie Steele led this Thompson Valley team to a very solid season last year, but now they are undefeated and the number 1 seed in the 3A playoffs. That is huge. Our next vote here, or next nominee, I should say, is Lutheran's very own Stephen Robbins here. He's kind of a mainstay here in this Coach of the Year candidacy, and a lot of it has to do with that very impressive spread that they're able to run. And boy, did they run it pretty dang well this season en route to a 9-1 record. They're the number 10 seed, but they averaged almost 40 points per game in the regular season while allowing 17, and this is with a lot of seniors having graduated from last year. They started off the season with a road Texas win, which was a really big deal, and it's always good to see Colorado get put on the map. And then they got another W before losing to Pueblo West on the road, 47-21. That was another great for a squad, and then would go undefeated the rest of the way, beating Resurrection Christian hard, Green Mountain, Stanley Lake, Hinckley, Holy Family by a touchdown in a crazy shootout, and then ending the season on a 55-point win over Kennedy. So they had themselves a pretty impressive season. Stephen Robbins, he's somebody that we hold in very high regard here at the podcast, and we appreciate everything that he does on that Lions squad. And lastly here we have is Jason Klatt of the Mavericks here in Meade. This team had a very, very good regular season here. They secured the number 2 seed heading into the postseason here, averaging nearly 30 points per game while holding opposing offenses to under 10 points per game here. And yeah, overall, you got to be really happy with how this season went. And, you got to feel happy running into the postseason. They did lose their last game 13-7 versus Windsor, but that's a very tough team. They beat other good teams like a playoff team in Pueblo South, playoff team in Frederick, 16-14. That is a statement win. They beat Holy Family on the road, 22-15 here, and then just took care of business the rest of the way this season. So let's go ahead and turn to our votes here for Coach of the Year to see where everyone ruled on here. Now, for our very first vote here, it's going to be Phoenix here, who is voting for Jamie Steele of Thompson Valley, saying, quote, Thompson Valley is probably having one of the best years in school history, and he has the Eagles sitting undefeated with a not-so-flashy offense that scores a lot of points. But you don't really need to worry about that when the defense has been pretty much impenetrable, only allowing roughly 5 points per game on average this season. Now, I'm going to spice it up a little bit here by checking out our end of the year vote here. Jamie Steele did receive second place in your vote, the fans that is, at 30% out of 184 votes. If you ever want to sway these, you're going to have to log into Twitter/X and you're going to have to vote. So please do that. Follow us while you're at it and vote on these polls here. But Jamie Steele secures the second place nod from our fans here. And then with Stephen Robbins and Jason Klatt finishing 4th and 3rd respectively, that means that Nate Johnson is your fan voted Coach of the Year for the 2024 3A season here. So that puts us at a 1-1 tie here. Now moving over to Coach V, he is going to put his vote down for Jason Klatt here of Meade and their season turnaround here. Obviously this Meade team has seen their tough fair share of struggles since making it to state a few years ago, but Coach V is very impressed with what he has seen and has a vote for Jason Klatt here. So that puts us at 1-1-1 here. However, Gino is going to pull Jamie Steele back ahead here, saying, quote, there were definitely some question marks surrounding Thompson Valley on how they were going to handle losing so many playmakers from last year, but Coach Steele has shattered all those questions by leading TV to an undefeated regular season with the number 1 defense in 3A. He definitely deserves this award for making this team even better than last year, end quote. So Steele gets a 1-score lead here, and I'm really going to shake things up by giving 1 vote to Stephen Robbins here. Look, Lutheran was a team that made state last year, and they lost a lot of starting seniors. I mean, up front on the line. I mean, their quarterback. I mean, receivers that transferred out. And this team still produced an offense that scored at a clip of around 40 points per game. They were heavily, assisted by a very strong running game, which is not usually their forte. Well, they can usually run the ball pretty well, but I would definitely say that they prefer to pass. And their offense was still pretty balanced, but, for them to still go 9-1 and to overcome a kind of an abnormal amount of turnovers, I would say, is just absolutely huge for me. And I love the scheme that he runs. And so that's why my vote is going to be for Stephen Robbins of Lutheran. However, our winner and the final vote selected by Gideon here to cement his status as the 3A 2024 Playmakers Corner Coach of the Year is Jamie Steele here, with Gideon saying, quote, Steele has quickly emerged as one of the top coaches in 3A, and in his second year, he has led Thompson Valley to their first perfect regular season in school history. Before the season, I said a realistic record was 8-2 with the ceiling of 10-0. He exceeded that expectation. I said that TV would have a top 5 defense. He made them the number 1 defense. If I said Thompson Valley could turn water to wine, Steele would probably serve me a 3-course meal, end quote. So with Gideon, Gino, and Phoenix voting all for Jamie Steele, that is 3 votes. That is the majority of the votes. And so your 2024 3A Coach of the Year is none other than Thompson Valley's Jamie Steele. Congratulations to Coach Steele, as well as the rest of the nominees for an awesome season. And best of luck, as most of these teams, at least as of this recording, are still in a postseason hunt for that elusive chip. That does open up the door for our very next category here, which is Newcomer of the Year. This goes to the most outstanding freshman in a given classification here. So let's go ahead and meet the contestants here and talk about some of their notable performances from this season. So, one of the very first people that we are talking about here is going to be Nick Leopardi here out of Holy Family. Now, this freshman did have a pretty solid season here, going for 269 receiving yards, 2 receiving touchdowns, as well as a few rushing yards here. Now, Holy Family, this was the defending state champs here, so we already knew that they were going to be climbing a little bit of an uphill battle, trying to replace some of the crazy production that they got from last year's squad here. But that did not stop Nick here from trying to make his mark and really just impress in his very first season starting for this Holy Family team that did make a return to the postseason, lest I remind you. So shout out to Nick here and his contributions to Holy Family's return to the postseason just 1 year after winning state. Keeping it in Broomfield, Colorado, we have Adam Moore out of Holy Family here. He also had a very impressive freshman campaign here. On defense, that is. That's where he really shined. He had 20 tackles and 3 interceptions. One of those he took to the house for a pick 6 and an overall collection of 51 interception return yards. It's so hard to be able to be a big-time playmaker, at least in my opinion, on the defensive side of the ball, and that's exactly what he did. And when we look at the notable games from these Holy Family performers here, you got to look at Hinckley, where Adam Moore had 2 of his picks, and Lutheran, where he had 1 of his interceptions. And then as far as tackles go, he had himself a pretty solid season. 6 tackles in that Stanley Lake game, including 1 for loss, and 6 tackles in that Lutheran game, being a part of his high volume. And then to just kind of ping pong a little bit back to Nick here, he had a very solid receiving performance in the very opener against Northridge, where he collected a 68-yard receiving touchdown. He posted a season-high 4 receptions for 58 yards in a tough loss to Pueblo East, and he was just utilized pretty well in those games, as well as just recording a reception, usually a big play threat, as his average yards per catch was 21.5 this season, in a pretty solid year for the young receiver. Moving over to the western slope, however, we have a nominee from Summit, Colorado, or from Summit High School that's in Frisco, Colorado, and that is none other than Connor Irwin out of Summit here. He was kind of a do-it-all guy for this team. He had 108 rushing yards, a rushing touchdown, 41 receiving yards, and then on defense, 33 tackles, a pick, and a fumble recovery, as well as a handful of kickoff return yards. His most notable defensive game was easily Steamboat Springs here, where he had 8 solo tackles and 12 total tackles here, and got a 1-point win over a pretty solid Steamboat Springs team. And then in some losing efforts here, he got a fumble recovery against Glenwood Springs on top of 3 total tackles. That was the very first game that he saw action defensively. And then Wheat Ridge, in only a 5-point loss, he had his pick and 23 interception return yards on that interception. I think it's a valiant effort. I think that he did some things very, very well throughout this season and was pretty impressive defensively. Offensively here, not necessarily as many looks, but when you look at rushing, he did get 60 yards against Palisade. That was a season high. And then he also got 48 yards against Skyview in a win. So, those are areas that he was able to contribute to for this Summit team that is looking to build something for the future. And it looks like it should be surrounding Connor Irwin. And last but not least, we have Glenwood Springs High School here with Lamani Portillo for the Demons, who is a bit of a demon himself. 210 rush yards, 3 rushing touchdowns, 97 kickoff return yards, and 7 tackles on the season. So definitely primarily an offensive weapon here. Now, he did have a decent amount of kickoff return yards, but let's face it, running the football is where his forte was, and that's exactly what he did with a very impressive performance against the likes of George Washington High School. 8 rushes, 101 yards, and 2 rushing touchdowns. He would also rush for a touchdown against Northridge and then have a few other 20-yard performances throughout the season for this Glenwood Springs team. Now, we get to turn our heads towards the voters here and see what they were thinking as we try to decide our 2024 3A Newcomer of the Year. When we start off here, it is going to be Gideon kicking us off since he's the one who shut the door on the last one, and his vote is for Lamani Portillo here, saying, quote, with Mason Markovich graduating, Glenwood Springs needs a foundation to build on. I think that Portillo will be a key part of that moving forward, and that his performance this year is as solid as you can hope for a freshman in that running back room, end quote. So, first vote is for Lamani Portillo here. Gino is going to build that lead for Lamani here, saying, quote, Glenwood Springs has a clear successor to Mason Markovich, and his name is Lamani Portillo. He made a very solid impact as a freshman and should see massive increases across the board next season. So, end quote. That's a lot of love for Glenwood Springs here on our first 2 votes, but I'm going to swing it the other way here and vote for Adam Moore here out of Holy Family. I just find being able to contribute defensively very, very impressively, and I really like his big tackle games against Lutheran as well as Stanley Lake, where he had 6 apiece as well as a tackle for loss. Lutheran only in a 7-point loss, Stanley Lake in a win, and I think that, out of everybody, that, this Holy Family defense probably had the most question marks for me heading into the season, so seeing help from that secondary makes a massive difference on my confidence in this team heading forward, and that's why Adam Moore is going to receive my Newcomer of the Year vote. That being said here, he is going to be echoed by Phoenix here, who says, quote, I'm going to give Moore my vote since coming in as a freshman on defense isn't easy, and being able to come away with 3 INTs and returning 1 for a touchdown is a tremendous impact for a very solid Holy Family team, end quote. So, Phoenix and I thinking alike here, and both voting for Adam Moore. Now, to go to you, the fans here, Adam Moore placed second in total votes here, which is a bit of a surprise, and Lamani placed third in total votes at 25 and 23% here. So who does that mean you selected as the freshman of the year? Nick Leopardi here out of Holy Family, still keeping it up north in Broomfield. He collected 40% of the votes on 466 votes. That is super impressive. Thank you all for voting on that one, and continue to vote, as the more votes, the merrier, and the more interesting it makes these polls here. Shout out to Connor Irwin collecting 12% himself. But with the vote split 2-2 and 1 with Nick Leopardi here, it is up to Coach V to be our final vote, and Coach is going with... Tried to do a light drum roll on the mic itself. Not sure if it worked, but you know what does work is Coach V's vote and the final vote to secure 3A Newcomer of the Year, which is Lamani Portillo out of Glenwood Springs High School. Honestly, the position of Mason Markovich graduating and Lamani being in the room with some things to prove just has to get some people excited for what the future holds for Glenwood Springs. So congratulations to all of the nominees. I'm only a little bitter that Adam didn't win, but all of these guys should have pretty solid high school football careers. And Lamani Portillo is the one who brings home the hardware, winning our Playmakers Corner 2024 3A Newcomer of the Year award. And now we move on to our third category, which is Defensive Playmaker of the Year for the 2024 3A football season. And we're going to start kind of down here. This is actually the furthest south of the nominees here, and that is Frankie Pacheco out of Pueblo South High School. He had himself a phenomenal season here. The defensive end, 89 tackles, 15 tackles for loss. That's like a sixth of the time he was getting those tackles in the backfield, as well as a pick, a forced fumble, 2 fumble recoveries, and one of those recoveries and that pick going all the way to the Casa here. So, looking at his notable games here, he had incredible performances against the likes of Meade, 12 total tackles, 3 for loss, 2 TFLs against Skyline, and then against Pueblo County here, I want to say, Pueblo County here. He had 12 total tackles, 10 solo, 2 for loss, and then Harrison, 15 tackles, 4 for loss here, and just multiple double-digit tackle performances, including against Disco in the season finale, 17 total, 3 for loss, and then 13 against Lewis Palmer, and a very close loss here for Frankie Pacheco, or Francisco Pacheco here for the full name, out of Pueblo South. Working our way up north, or so I think we are, because I'm not entirely sure, but I think DJ here is next here, but he is here, and he is here to make a difference here. Defensively, had a very solid season, 68 tackles, 11 of those being for loss, as well as 4 sacks, 2 hurries, and a pass deflection here for this Pomona defense that had a significant step up from last season here, and they needed somebody like DJ here to take a huge step forward. This defense was fantastic. They did not average a lot of points allowed per game here in the regular season, only 12, and DJ here is a part of that in a big way. He had some notable games like the opening game against Kennedy with 7 tackles and 1 for loss. Against Pueblo West, he had 2 tackles for loss. Against Roosevelt in a 42-13 win, 13 total tackles and 3 for loss. And then against the likes of Mountain View, 8 tackles and 2 for loss in just a really good season for DJ. Moving along here, Keaton Everett here. He's somebody who we've kind of had our eyes on for a decent amount of time, and he showed out his senior year on defense to the tune of 73 tackles, 19 and a half of those being for loss, 8 sacks, 13 hurries, 2 forced fumbles, 3 fumble recoveries, one of those going to the house, as well as 3 pass deflections and a punt block here. He was everything that the Bulldogs needed and some in this fantastic season that included 9 tackles in the opening win against Delta, 11 total tackles, and 2 of those for loss against another school in week 2. Against Durango in week 4, which is a 4A squad, he had 9 total tackles and 3.5 of those being for loss. And then in league play, just put on a dominant performance of games here to help them secure a playoff spot. 3 TFLs against Summit, 2.5 against Rifle, 1 against Steamboat Springs, and 4 against Eagle Valley. And then in the final game of the season against Glenwood Springs, the regular season that is, 9 total tackles. Just a very, very well put together defensive season for Keaton Everett out of Palisade, and was integral to their run here to punch their ticket to the playoffs. And now here, going up north to the number 1 defense in all of 3A and the number 1 seed of all 3A, we got CJ James here out of Thompson Valley, 52 tackles, 7.5 of those for loss, as well as 5.5 sacks, 3 forced fumbles, and a fumble recovery. Once again, this defense only allowed 5 points per game, and his contributions are super important and impressive to that dub. And to go to our votes here, you all agreed here that CJ James was the most impressive performer here, as in our Playmaker of the Year, Defensive Playmaker of the Year votes. He received 32% of the votes, making him number 1, finishing just ahead of DJ here on 30%, Frankie Pacheco on 28%, and Keaton Everett at 10%. That's 514 total votes. Thank you all so much for coming out and voting. be sure to check us out on Twitter/X and get your votes in for our remaining polls that include 4A and 5A for the season. Moving along, though, it is going to be a turn of the tide the rest of the way as Coach V opens up with a vote for Pacheco here, saying, quote, "It's hard to win Depoy as an interior defensive lineman, but he has played well enough for this consideration. His signature game against Pueblo Central and those guards definitely sold me," end quote. So now it is a 1-1 tie for Pacheco and for our guy up north, CJ James. Moving along, though, we have another solid performance here from Pacheco that wins over Gino, saying, quote, "No one can disrupt an entire interior offensive line quite like Frankie Pacheco. There's a ton of great defensive talent in 3A this year, and yet it's Pacheco's work inside for Pueblo South that stands above other players. His massive tackle numbers show me that he's doing quite literally everything he can for this Pueblo South defense." Now, to keep it moving here, Gideon is going to throw in another vote for Pacheco, saying, quote, "When someone looks at the numbers that Pacheco put up this season, you would expect a linebacker, not a defensive tackle. For Pacheco to have the impact that he does is almost unheard of at that position. Further, he actually does worse against bad teams. It's the Jamal Murray effect. His best performances are under the brightest lights, and he's held his own against players almost 100 pounds heavier than he is," end quote. And his second place vote was for Keaton Everett. We don't do a ranked choice system, but I really want to shout out Keaton and the impressive season that he had for Palisade. And those stats really do pop off. But for me personally, I'm going to just have to follow in line here and vote for Pacheco as well, just because an interior defensive lineman having this impact is just simply unheard of. And I do not think that Pueblo South probably makes the postseason if it is not for Pacheco's efforts here. So I'm going to vote for Pacheco and foreshadow that Phoenix is also voting for Pacheco, saying, quote, "He is a true defensive playmaker, able to get 15 tackles for loss and getting turnovers in any way he can and making the other team suffer for it. 1 interception return for a touchdown, a forced fumble, and 2 recoveries, with 1 being returned for a touchdown. That is some top-tier defensive playmaking. The 89 tackles is just the cherry on top." And I got to agree. I mean, honestly, the way that he's able to score, I mean, that pick 6 is against Harrison. One of those fumble recoveries are against Lewis Palmer and Discovery Canyon. He's trying to keep these teams in this game here, especially that Discovery Canyon game where they end up losing by 9. He has 6 of those points with his fumble return for a touchdown. It's really hard to get a defender to score points, honestly, and for him to do it at the nose guard position and just on that interior is very, very impressive. He's somebody that you could probably slide across the line anywhere, but his impact, strength, and durability all stick out. And that is why Frankie Pacheco, or Francisco Pacheco out of Pueblo South, is your 2024 3A Defensive Playmaker of the Year. And now we move on to the Offensive Playmaker of the Year here. Let's go ahead and take a look at the candidates here, starting off with Isaac McCune here out of Wheat Ridge. This senior quarterback passed for 2,117 yards with 22 touchdowns to just 6 interceptions, but added on another 544 rushing yards and 6 rushing touchdowns. Some of his notable games included the season opener against Stanley Lake, where he went 14 of 18 for 273 yards and 5 passing touchdowns, and added on a rushing touchdown as well as 60 rushing yards. Additionally, he also had a big game against Niwot and Middle Park back-to-back with 3 and 4 passing touchdowns respectively, while adding on a rushing touchdown against Niwot and one of his highest performances of 81 rushing yards. Against Green Mountain is where he had his best rushing game, 6 carries for 116 yards and a rushing touchdown, while also passing for 290 yards in that game. He followed that up with a 300-yard performance against Conifer, 2 touchdowns to just 1 pick in that game. And then with a bounce-back win following those two, 17 of 24, 325 passing yards and 4 passing touchdowns to 0 interceptions in what would be his best passing effort for the remainder of the season. So those are the standout performances of Isaac McCune of Wheat Ridge. Moving along here, we got Trip Thomas out of Windsor 868 rushing yards, 17 rushing touchdowns, along with 86 receiving yards, a receiving touchdown, and nearly 300 kickoff return yards, along with a punt return for a touchdown here and a conversion. So looking at some of his best games here, following a slow start in game 1, he would bounce back with 2 consecutive 100-yard games, including a 105 4-touchdown performance game here against Montebello, and he would continue to kind of hover around that 100-yard benchmark here, but would finally beat it again with a 127-yard performance against Timnath and a 111-yard performance against Meade near the end of the season. And then as far as kickoff return yards, his big game came against Longmont here, where he did have 104 total yards, obviously ripping off something quite substantial in that game in order to help this team produce, get good field position, and score points here. His punt return touchdown was against Green Mountain here. So, that is the marks of a solid season here. And that's exactly what Trip Thomas was able to do for this Windsor team, was provide big play opportunity and just rush the ball and be a consistent presence on that offense. Moving along here, Hayden Jones, the quarterback out of Discovery Canyon, were flipping positions here, heading down to the Springs here. And this guy had an electric season. Simon got to see some of his best performances here. But on the season, 1,007 pass yards, 17 touchdowns to just 4 picks, but another 901 rushing yards and 19 rushing touchdowns, making for 36 total touchdowns and nearly 1,900 total yards. He was just very, very effective when he did choose to run the ball. But as far as passing performances goes, he had a pretty solid start. Pueblo County, that was a very good playoff team here. 12 of 19, 179 yards, and 2 touchdowns to no picks. You move further down the line, 9 of 13 for 116 yards against Pueblo County instead of Pueblo Central. So just getting those sorted out, both of those Pueblo teams. And then 116 yards and a touchdown, no picks. 3 touchdowns, no picks against Harrison. 4 touchdowns, no picks against Palmer. So overall, just pretty solid through the air, but running the football here. Pueblo East in a big win, 14 rushes, 119 yards, and 3 rushing touchdowns against Pueblo County. 13 rushes, 148 yards, and 4 rushing touchdowns. He would rush for a touchdown in 8 games to start the season, including against Lewis Palmer, 24 carries, 229 yards, and 3 rushing touchdowns. He would also rush for 3 touchdowns against Pueblo South. He was just an offensive engine and completely integral to this team's success and towards making the postseason en route to an 8-2 final regular season record. So shout out Hayden Jones. Our final candidate here is going to be from Pueblo South here, and that's going to be Jake Piscata here. And what Jake was able to do was catch 10 receiving touchdowns and 924 receiving yards, just being a consistent offensive weapon for the Colts here. When you look at his season, he opened up with a 5-reception, 101-yard performance against Meade, where he also caught a touchdown and had a long of 50. He followed that up with a 6-reception, 89-yard performance against Falcon, where he also notched a touchdown. He'd have a bounce-back week following the Pueblo East game, where he would begin to go on an absolute tear. 3 consecutive 100-yard games, starting with Skyline, 9 receptions, 153 yards, and a score. And then against their next opponent here, being another Pueblo County squad here, was 6 receptions, 120 yards, and then against Palmer, 6 receptions, 133 yards. So those were his big performances on the season. With all of that in mind, let's go ahead and turn our attention towards the voters here and figure out who our offensive playmaker of the year is. Now, when we look at the fan poll, we got 394 votes, so thank you for coming out and voting. Be sure to find us on Twitter/X and let your voice be heard. But this one was a very interesting poll here because everybody was tied percentage-wise, but that means that one vote or another slipped one of these candidates just slightly ahead here. So Isaac McCune and Trip Thomas, kudos to them. They both got 20% of the vote. And then Hayden Jones and Jake Piscata here both got 30%, but Hayden Jones with the very slight edge, meaning that he probably got one or two more votes here. Every single vote counted, and Hayden Jones was the 3A 2024 Offensive Playmaker of the Year, according to you, the fans. So that's a great place to start. Now I'm going to pan over to the person who saw him the most this season, and that was Coach V saying, quote, "This DCC offense revolves around Jones as they use him as both a runner and passer. He has shown that he can do both, and DCC has had one of the best seasons, its best seasons, because of how dynamic he is," end quote. Gino is going to keep that rolling, saying Hayden Jones has led a powerhouse offense for DCC with his incredible dual threat ability. It's tough to slow DCC on offense because Jones can beat you in any way he sees fit. Throw in the fact he's got 36 total TDs, and this one becomes a no-brainer. Gideon is not going to switch it up on y'all. He is voting for Hayden Jones, saying, quote, "Jones is the DCC offense. He's the last man you want to see under center if you're a defense because you know he's going to make you pay for being even a half a step behind. There isn't much to exploit about him, and there's a reason that DCC is a home seed in the playoffs for the first time in years," end quote. We check in with Phoenix, and he says, quote, "He practically runs the Discovery Canyon offense and gets it done in any way he can. Just over 1,000 yards through the air with a 17-4 TD to INT ratio. But what's been the most impressive is the 901 yards on the ground and an insane 19 rushing touchdowns. He's quite literally the definition of an offensive playmaker," end quote. And I'm not going to make it any different. I'm going to make this a unanimous selection for the 2024 3A Offensive Playmaker of the Year and give it to Hayden Jones, just because 36 touchdowns is just an absurd amount, especially in relation to the rest of 3A and what everybody else was able to accomplish. And I don't think that Discovery Canyon is a playoff team without him. I think he's very integral to that team. He probably could have even made a push for most valuable playmaker, but I digress. He'll have to settle for being a unanimous 3A 2024 Offensive Playmaker of the Year. Congratulations to Hayden Jones, as well as the other nominees. We're going to take a quick break and then be back with our Most Valuable Playmaker Award. Obviously, you want a trainer who can make you stronger and faster with the work you put in, but what about a trainer who can help you rehab and recover like the pros? Look no further than Junkyard Training, that not only offers specific strength and speed training, but also offers a plethora of recovery and rehab techniques like cryo, cupping, recovery boots, and so much more. Learn more today by visiting junkyardtraining.net or call 303-521-7594. Once again, visit junkyardtraining.net or call 303-521-7594 and get started today. And welcome back here. We're very excited to go ahead and address our most valuable playmaker. But first, I'm going to read the All-Playmaker Corner teams here, so that way you just know. The big thing about All-Playmaker is that we actually have position limits, unlike CHASA. So if you are not one of the best at your position, you're just not going to be selected. We are forced to make some very tough decisions here. I'm looking specifically at the offensive line category that was an absolute nightmare this season, on top of the quarterback position that was pretty close, and just a couple of other positions that had some really tough decisions that we had to vote on and, make some tough cuts on. But starting at the quarterback position, we only carry two of these. We ended up going with Hayden Jones and Benson White out of Discovery Canyon and Conifer, respectively. Moving along to running back here, we selected Mason Markovich and Sawyer Wald of Glenwood Springs and Lutheran, respectively. At wide receiver, Jake Piscata here out of Pueblo South, Isaiah Trujillo out of Pueblo East, and Solomon Washer out of Conifer here. Anderson Osborne was our tight end selected out of Holy Family. At offensive tackle, Deacon Schmidt of Windsor and Andreas Guyeri out of Green Mountain. And on the interior offensive line, Vincent Johnston of Palisade, Zion Suavo of Pueblo Central, and Grant Gordon of Meade were all of the selections. Moving to the defensive side of the ball, Josiah Manu was selected along with Frankie Pacheco out of the Thompson Valley and Pueblo South defenses respectively for D tackle. At edge, CJ James and Keaton Everett were both selected out of Thompson Valley and Palisade respectively. At linebacker, we went with Vince Hochhalter and Barrett Plews out of Timnath and Mountain View. Joseph Euretia out of Thompson Valley made cornerback along with Reed Green of Severance and Ernest Matson of Pueblo Central. At safety, Noah Sanchez of Pomona and Matthew Harms of Canyon City were our selections. At kicker, Oliver Hansen of Holy Family and Sean Balch of Roosevelt. And at punter, Dylan Gonsholt of Summit was the selection. Congratulations to the All-Playmaker teams, including our athlete spot that we only have one of that went to Bennett Wilkes of Wheat Ridge. Thank you all so much for giving us a fantastic 3A season, and for all the people who didn't get mentioned that made it hard to leave you off the list, that made for quite the difficult time, but kudos on a good season nonetheless. Now, with all that mentioned, we get to the 2024 3A Most Valuable Playmaker nominees. Let's go ahead and run it down here, starting off with all the names that you were like, hey, what the heck? We just heard those names on All PMC, but we didn't hear them later. Well, let's go ahead and take a look, starting with Mason Markovich of Glenwood Springs here, 1,361 rushing yards, 21 rushing touchdowns, along with 59 tackles, 10 tackles for loss, and a pick, as well as 2 fumble recoveries and 4 pass deflections on defense. Looking at some of his big offensive performances, he had 2 consecutive 200-yard games against the likes of Summit and Northridge, going for 248 and 219 respectively, with 4 and 5 touchdowns in those games. Against Basalt here, he still went for 132 yards. And then against George Washington, 129 yards, 3 touchdowns. Conifer, 209 yards, 5 rushing touchdowns in that game, tied for a season high. And then 214 yards in a close loss to Eagle Valley. Those are his notable offensive performances. When you flip it over to the defensive side of the ball, he had some big ones. And a close loss to Elizabeth to start the year. 10 total tackles, 6 solo, 1 for loss. Against Summit, 3 tackles, all of them being for loss. Against Basalt, 13 total tackles. Conifer, 10 total tackles, and 4 tackles for loss. Those are some of his big ones. And then an interception against Northridge, and then fumble recoveries against Elizabeth and Palisade. So that is Mason Markovich's season, dominating on both sides of the football. We're going to see another great athlete get it done on both sides of the football, and that's Bennett Wilkes of Wheat Ridge here. 1,201 receiving yards, 14 receiving touchdowns, 112 rushing yards, 2 rushing touchdowns, 229 kick return yards. And then defensively, 48 tackles, 1 for loss, 7 interceptions, and 3 of those being returned to the house, a forced fumble, 4 pass deflections, and 231 interception return yards. Means that he was an absolute lunatic this season, both sides of the ball just being a fantastic athlete. When we look at some of his best offensive performances here, you have to look at the season opener against Stanley Lake, 7 receptions, 151 yards, and 3 receiving touchdowns. You also got to look to the Middle Park game, 171 receiving yards, and a hat trick of touchdowns once again. Against Green Mountain, 12 receptions, a season high, for 150 yards and a score. He posted another 144-yard game against Conifer and a 137-yard game against Skyview, and then ended the season with a 167-yard performance against Summit. Defensively, a lot of tackles here taking place. He had 3 straight games of 7 tackles against Pomona, Green Mountain, and Conifer here, and then another 7-tackle performance against Evergreen, so played up as far as tackles in those games, I guess. Against some of those better teams, some bigger plays probably coming across the field. And then interception-wise, 1 against Stanley Lake with 55 interception return yards, 2 against Niwot with 70, Middle Park 2 with 106, and then 2 picks against Skyview in a solid season, along with 4 pass deflections and a forced fumble against Evergreen. That is Bennett Wilkes out of Wheat Ridge. Congratulations to the Northern Colorado commit and somebody who we've been able to keep an eye on for a few years now. Our next nominee here is Sawyer Wald here out of Lutheran High School. 1,493 rushing yards and 21 rushing touchdowns, while also being a check down target in the passing game, catching for 170 receiving yards and 2 receiving touchdowns, not to mention his 10 tackles and 4 tackles for loss to go with his 1 sack to show his defensive prowess as well. But offensively is definitely where he was important. Look, he ran for over 100 yards in every game in the regular season except for 2. And those 2 were blowouts where their team ended up winning over by 50. So he was just pulled early in those games, given some rest, but was very integral to the team's success in the other games. Against Cooper, that out-of-state team, 19 carries, 103 yards, and a touchdown. But when he came back home, was it a homecoming of sorts? I would say so. Fort Morgan, 213 yards and 3 rushing touchdowns. Those would be his highest totals until they faced Stanley Lake. 20 carries, 266 yards, a season high, to go with his 5 rushing touchdowns to this point, both being season highs. But he would outdo himself in a 1-touchdown win over league rival Holy Family. 38 carries, 355 yards, and 5 rushing touchdowns. As if he couldn't do any more, he shows that he actually can and gets it done here. In their only loss of the season, by the way, against Pueblo West, he ends up scoring 2 of their 3 total touchdowns, going 22 carries for 109 yards and a score, as well as 4 receptions for 59 yards and a score, those being his best receiving performances in that game where they needed him the absolute most. And as far as tackles go, he had a TFL against Cooper, 2 TFLs against Stanley Lake, and 1 against Heakley, as well as a sack in that Cooper game. And I'm sure that if they had other resources on offense, he would have been going 2 ways all the time. And finally, our final nominee here is going to be Dolphka Lewis, over 2,000 total yards, 1,113 yards for him through the air, as well as 15 touchdowns to just 3 picks, and 964 rushing yards to go with 18 rushing touchdowns. That makes for 33 total touchdowns on the season for Dolphka Lewis. Unfortunately, I don't think that we're able to take a look at his specific game-by-game stats. No, yes, we are. So let's go ahead and take a look at those, seeing as how he had some fantastic performances throughout the season, both rushing and passing the football. The Fort Morgan game, he had 3 total touchdowns, 2 rushing and 1 passing with about 150 total yards. Kind of struggle against Discovery Canyon, but would bounce back against Pueblo South in a classic rivalry battle here. He'd go 6 of 13 for 95 yards through the air, but on the ground, 27 carries, a season high, mind you, for 187 yards and 2 rushing touchdowns, and the W in that crosstown rivalry. Against Northfield in a close one, 20 carries, 87 yards, 2 rushing touchdowns, along with a passing touchdown and 102 yards. Holy Family, this was a huge win for this program this year. He went 14 of 18 for 151 yards passing with 2 touchdowns to no picks, while adding on a season-high 211 rushing yards and 4 rushing touchdowns. I am like 90% sure he won Playmaker of the Week in that week. He would then follow that up later in the season against Pueblo County with a very impressive 13 of 26 for 209 yards. And by Pueblo County, I meant Pueblo Central. Sorry, they are both PCHS on here. But 13 of 26, 209 yards, and 4 passing touchdowns to just 1 pick. That is easily his best passing performance of the season, and it's hard to see why he might not have more of those. And in addition to that, on the ground, 69 rushing yards may not catch your attention, but the 2 rushing touchdowns obviously means that this is a 6-touchdown performance, and that is every single point for this Pueblo East team against Pueblo Central in what was an upset win for them to win 41-36. Moving along, he had another fantastic rushing performance with 113 rushing yards against Coronado and 2 rushing touchdowns, as well as a decent completion percentage of 65%. That is Dolphka Lewis, and that is the representation of the Pueblo East Hornets. Now, we get to the serious part here with the most valuable playmaker voting system here. And we're going to start off with Coach V here, who places his first vote for Sawyer Wald out of Lutheran, saying, quote, all of these players are good ball players, but in my opinion, this is about getting wins and contributing to winning efforts against quality teams. Dolphka Lewis was in consideration for me with his big games versus South, Central, and Northfield, but Wald has had his share of big-time games. His games against Green Mountain and Holy Family specifically were electric, and that is what sold me when it came down to it, end quote. So 1 vote for Sawyer Wald here. Now I'm going to send us back up north here, where Phoenix is also going to vote for Sawyer Wald, saying, quote, he has been vital for Lutheran this season, and it showed on offense, coming just 7 yards short of 1,500 on the ground, as well as his 21 rushing touchdowns. He's been the top back in 3A, and without him, Lutheran would have struggled immensely this season. His value to the team is probably the most valuable in 3A. We're going to keep it up north here with our Fort Collins representation and go with Gideon, who has quite the blurb, so buckle in and hold on because this is quite the roller coaster here. Saying, quote, I spent a lot of time thinking about this. I'm so torn between Bennett Wilkes and Mason Markovich. Both these players mean so much to their teams, performed well both ways, and ended up having amazing seasons. Bennett, depending on how you count it, is either the 12th or 7th most prolific receiver in state history. He caught an insane amount of picks and returned half of them for touchdowns. Mason was Glenwood, and that team's identity, especially with the new coach, centered around Markovich and what he could do. The Demons went as far as he went. Ultimately, my decision came down to a few factors. Who was more available? Wilkes played 10 out of 10, while Markovich missed a game for injury. Share of the offense? Mason has a slight edge there, with no other rusher over 400 yards, but Wilkes is close, with more rushing yards than Mason has receiving yards. On defense, Mason had more tackles, but Wilkes had 6 more interceptions, along with more defensive touchdowns. Both teams went 5-5, with a lot of overlap in that schedule. Ultimately, my decision is coming down to this. What would this team have been without Bennett or Mason? And in that case, I have to give it to Mason just slightly. Without Mason Markovich, Glenwood Springs loses their identity, they lose their soul, they lose the guy on this squad. Bennett is the guy on his team as well, but without him, they still have an offense and identity between Isaac McCune and Xavier Edwards. They still have an offense. Glenwood has the beginnings of a new offense, but against anyone but this year's Rifle, I don't trust that team without Mason. So that is 1 vote, end quote, for Mason Markovich out of Glenwood Springs. And let's go ahead and head over to the fan poll where you too were also torn like Gideon here. Sawyer and Dolphka received 9 and 7% of the votes here, but tied at 42% was Bennett Wilkes and Mason Markovich here. And so when it comes down to that, that means every single vote matters. And from my understanding, I guess there was some kind of an error with this. But regardless, the final votes at 664, with 1 or 2 votes probably being the difference here, was Mason Markovich gets the tiebreaker here and is the fan-voted 2024 3A Playmaker of the Year, according to the fans. But that puts us at a 2-2 split heading into Gino's quote here, who is going to break the tie, but does not necessarily guarantee it with Mason having the tiebreaker. But that is a spoiler, as Gino is voting for Sawyer Wald, saying, quote, Lutheran was a tough squad with some signature wins this year, and that is in large in part to Wald's work in the run game. Nearly 1,500 yards and 21 touchdowns on the year, which leads all of 3A running backs. I admire Lutheran's ability to adjust their play style to accommodate for their top playmakers, and Wald has absolutely flourished in that system, end quote. So, with a 3-2 Sawyer Wald lead, my vote to crown the 3A most valuable playmaker of the 2024 season is Sawyer Wald out of Lutheran. Not going to leave it up to the final tiebreaker here. Sawyer is my selection as the 3A 2024 Playmaker of the Year with his performances and his ability to carry this team and this offense that normally is somebody that can, or is normally a unit that passes the ball very, very well, but had to switch it up this year, and they would not be able to do that if it was not for Sawyer and his efforts. Like Gino said, they had their share of some really good teams that they faced offensively, as well as Simon mentioning that Green Mountain game, 28 carries, 195 yards, and a rushing touchdown. They were able to just feed him the rock. And I also personally looked at that Holy Family game, 38 carries, 355 yards, and 5 rushing touchdowns is one of the most dominant performances by any single player this entire year. And that is why Sawyer Wold, along with them making the postseason, is a huge reason why I got to give it to him for his carry job, pun intended, of getting Lutheran to the postseason. And so with all of that being said here, taking a look back at all of our awards, our Coach of the Year went to Jamie Steele of Thompson Valley. Our Newcomer of the Year went to Lamani Portillo of Glenwood Springs. Our Defensive Playmaker of the Year, almost unanimously, went to Frankie Pacheco of Pueblo South. Our Offensive Playmaker of the Year, which was unanimous, went to Hayden Jones of Discovery Canyon. And the 2024 Most Valuable Playmaker is Lutheran's very own Sawyer Wold. Thank you to all of these players who were nominated. Thank you to everyone who's in consideration. Thank you to the All-Playmaker Teams for making this an electric season here for 3A in the 2024 season. And there's still a little bit of 3A action to go as we have semifinals this weekend and then the state championship up at Canvas next weekend. Stay tuned for all of that content and more awards content anywhere you listen to podcasts, whether that's Amazon Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere in general, like our YouTube. Go ahead and be subscribed to our YouTube channel where we also upload our episodes. Additionally to that, we also will be posting highlights and stuff to our TikTok at Playmakers Corner. So that takes care of some visual media for you, as well as seeing the highlights and what games we attend. Or if you want to get a head start and maybe find us at the games, follow us on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook. And that is at Playmaker Corner, Playmakers Corner, and Playmakers Corner, all respectively. We look forward to making some more graphics, having some more fun, and getting some more of these polls underway. But I have been your host for this episode, Cody Stauffer, signing off. Peace.